We're very glad, Brother Booker T. Coleman, to have you in our studios today as we begin the first in a series of world history from an African-centered perspective, understanding that Africa is central to understanding the evolution and the civilization and civilizations which man has evolved and built. So, Brother Booker T, today, if you would for us, please begin talking with us about the African origins of man and how man developed in Africa.
You know, what's interesting with the question is that the question itself, you might answer it being earthbound, but what we're attempting to do is look at it holistically. And what we've come to realize is that what we've attempted to do is to put the world, this is a small version, I have a larger version of this, but basically what this does is that it breaks up the cosmic reality or it creates a cosmic year. And the top map is a map of this great cosmic African year. And the bottom one is of a specific month. And as an educator in the Board of Ed here in New York, and just in general being interested in education, I find that even if we were to deal with humanity, humanity is a very late creation when you think of the entire cosmic reality. It is very difficult to understand man without the history of human because we are part of that cosmic evolutionary cycle. It is almost impossible just to look at the earth. When we look at the Dogon, we look at the Kemite, we look at the Bambara, you can go to Central Africa, the Kuba, K-U-B-A peoples, you can go to the Maasai of Kenya, you can look at a number of African traditions. And what you will notice is that they go beyond just an earth scope. They look at themselves as universal beings, that Earth just happens to be a satellite moving through the cosmos, of which we all happen to be astronauts. Because when you look at the word astronaut and astronomy itself, you're dealing with ast, which is the feminine principle of the origin, of determination of course her name is Aset. From ast you have Ra, which is the essence of star power, and Astra, and then you have Numo, or Numa, which gives the impression from Dogon of the origins of life in water. So astronomy, even of itself, we can come back into an African tradition, an African word, uniting Ast, Ra, Numo, which talks about the female principle being in the waters and the energy coming from this, Ast, Ra, Nomi. So when we look at this and we break it up into the year, if we were to say, and this is a theory, and I want to be very clear on this because none of us were there in the beginning of time. We cannot say with any surety, but there is a sense of knowledge base out there that will allow us to say certain things. So we've broken it up into 12 months, and we've said that the very first moment of the very first year of the cosmic reality, what is today called the Big Bang, what the ancient Kemites called Nun, or Ptah, the conversion of energy, that humanity, in fact, doesn't even come into place until December. And this is why we have the December month here, because so much happens this last month right here. So what we're dealing with in reality, if you want to talk about the history of man, you've got to talk about the history of the cosmos. To understand the history of the cosmos, you go to the primary source, which we call the Shabaka stone. There are the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Bremerin papyrus. Dr. Theophilio Benga has looked at over 77 documents. Sheikh Anta Diop has looked at numerous documents that unfold this story. And one thing is that the story doesn't begin on Earth. And that's the key. And what locks us into this shallow mentality as an African people, what confuses us most, is that we are confining ourselves to where the European was confined, and that is Earth. The European, by nature of him herself, could not survive in space, because the essence of the mutation of the Africans going to the Europoid state cancel out the nature of what keeps them alive in space, which is melanin. Melanin is what makes this whole cosmos. It is the life of the cosmos. It is in the blackness that light comes. So here in the very beginning of this cosmic reality, if you want to talk about the origins of man, we're dealing with this Big Bang. And from this Big Bang, scientifically speaking, particles, pieces, essences of life scatter throughout the cosmos. In other words, this seed, the Dogon called Kizi Uzi, from this seed, what the Kemites called Atun, from this seed that is encased all of this life, it explodes like an egg and it begins to move apart. And what happens is that superclusters are formed from this Big Bang. Superclusters then continue to grow and expand, and superclusters become clusters. So as you move into January and February, you're dealing with the supercluster life. So the early form of humanity dealt with being in the supercluster. And then superclusters began to give off pieces of itself, and then clusters were formed within the superclusters. And then within the clusters, they began to give off and to give birth to different universes and different realities. And clusters gave birth in the month of May and June to galaxies. And then galaxies began to throw pieces of itself off, and then star formations came into being. And then from star formations came planetary formations. And then what we have is that as you move into the last quarter, or I should say the last third of the cosmic year, in the month of September, in particular, on September 14th, the Earth came to be. If we were to break this down scientifically, the Earth would have come into existence in this great cosmic year on September 14th. On September 25th, the origin of life, or organic life, the assimilation of carbon, in other words, the melanic state being transformed on Earth, occurred on September 25th. And this organic life, this assimilation of carbon, occurred within the ponds, the oceans, and the waters of our Earth. On the 26th of September came molecular organization. Molecules began to order and arrange themselves. They began to reorder and rearrange themselves with other molecules, and then the different kinds of essences on Earth came to be, again, within the waters. In October, you would have had the stuff of life, which is the creation of life, was in abundance. In other words, through geometric progression, every month, by the way, represents almost, and this is just throwing out a figure, a little over 1 billion years, every month. Organic molecules begin coming into being through nuclear fusion, thermonuclear reaction, and reactions of them both coming together. This is all science, but this is deeply embedded in the Shabaka stone. This is why you can see that if we were to talk about humanity, and I just jumped into talking about the different forms of humanity, look how much of our history is missed, because clearly humanity existed from the very first moment of existence, but what needed to be was Kepra, or what the Kemites deciphered to be the process of becoming the transformation, the perfectibility of the cosmos, the God force coming to know him herself. Plants come to be in October, and multicellular beings within the waters come to be. In November, organic copulation, in other words, the coming together of sex, began approximately in November. The concept of two opposites coming together to create itself, to redo itself, comes to be. To regenerate itself comes to be. The law of polarity, in other words, is here. And then, of course, you have the microcosmos. In other words, the essences of these molecules coming together then begin to reflect the larger macrocosm. In other words, everything that exists becomes a small picture of the larger picture. Now, in December, as you can see, I don't even try to put anything here, because in December, through quantum understanding, we see that there are many things occurring on Earth. And of course, on December 1st, photosynthesis, a very important process, begins to take shape here on this planet. And then we were jumping the Precambrian age from the 2nd of December until approximately the 14th of December. So these basic 2 weeks show life in the waters. This is when all of the life in the waters start to come. And then on the 15th, you have a proliferation of life. In other words, life is just in abundance. It's all in the waters. It is in plant form. It is in the multicellular forms. It's in a number of different kinds of activities. When you come to the 17th, you start to look at creatures becoming, in essence. You begin to see these molecules creating essences of life. And the tribbolite was one of the ones that was created. It's like a squid-like creature. In the 19th of December comes the age of fishes. Now you're really looking at the earth formulating itself, because now you have the age of the fishes coming to be, where the fish and the vertebrates are in the water. On the 20th, the plants colonize land. In other words, this is where organic life comes on earth. Now, I know this is a sensitive issue. I know that from a Judeo-Christian ethic, I may not be discussing it the way it would be discussed, but I am a creationist. I believe that there was a creation, a God concept that created it. But I also believe that what was created went through evolutionary stages. It is so close to a fairy tale for me to believe that the first two humans were born adults on earth. That's like trying to get me to believe that there was a wolf that ate Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother and was in the bed waiting for Little Red Riding Hood. I have as much chance believing that story as I would a story of a human being being born as an adult. And it is time now, at least in my perspective, it is hard for me to continue this. It's like winking at stories so that we can get children to believe them. And I think it's time that we come to a reality that there was an African God concept, and that this concept evolved and went through stages. And the proof of it is that we are going through this stage to this very day. We are getting better. We see our young people smarter today than we were. I remember our adults telling us that we were smarter than they were. And I remember my father telling me that his father used to say he was smarter than his father. And that's because every generation is born with all of the information of the preceding generation. Hopefully, each generation should get better by the nature of the improvement of that particular generation's knowledge and wisdom. So I come before you with this information only to share it with you. This is not a belief system. I believe that I'm deeply spiritual, but Adam and Eve is just not a story that I can feel comfortable with in believing how I came into existence, particularly when I see so much evidence to the contrary. On the 22nd of December, the winged insects, the amphibians being these reptiles now, these fishes who are now coming up out of the water, and they're using their fins as sort of like feet. Because remember, the water is now drying up on Earth, and there are ponds created that they got to get from one water level to another, and that process sometimes made them go on land, and they would just crawl across. And those that survived were the ones that continued. The ones that were caught on the land didn't continue. So survival has a lot to do with the evolution of life on Earth. So the 23rd brings in the age of the reptiles. Trees begin to grow, and then you have amazing growth patterns in geometric progressions. In other words, by geometric progressions, meaning that many things are happening. It's not going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on down. It's going 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. It is by multiples that life is beginning to grow. The 24th, the dinosaurs are born. And they lived for 160 million years. Now, when you think of how long we've been around, look at how long the dinosaurs were around. And look at the arrogance that we have to think that we will be around forever. There are essences of life that once were on Earth. Now, dinosaurs to me is in question. I wonder whether or not dinosaurs existed. There's still a lot more work to be done in terms of exactly who the dinosaurs were and what they were. And I think that we have got to look at this. On the 26th of December was ushered in the age of the mammals. Now, the difference between a reptile and a mammal is that a reptile has the womb on the outside, which is the egg, and the mammal has the womb on the inside. Because when we left, reptiles are cold-blooded and humans are warm-blooded. So that when these reptiles transformed into amphibians, and these amphibians became mammals, what began to occur was that instead of laying an egg and your womb was on the outside and it was hatched by the sun, what occurred was that the egg was on the inside. And there was a relationship developed between the soon-to-be-born essence and the mother of the essence. And it was the mother that nurtured, and it was in the womb that the God concept and consciousness began to develop, and that is why it would lead to other kinds of formations that eventually became us as human beings. Our original state we all were once plants. And from plants gave off organisms that would probably later become those essences that would then come out of the water and become. So we all come from a long line of a great creative force. But we weren't born as adults, at least as far as I can see. We were born and we evolved. And we don't evolve. Consciousness evolves. We just happen to be the vehicle that consciousness chooses to evolve into, because we have all the things that are necessary. And when we talk about some of our distant relatives, you'll see how we were chosen quite by mistake. It wasn't done because we were destined. We were destined, but we weren't destined the way the other forms were destined. We don't have a specialization. Every animal form has a reason to be on Earth. We have no reason to be on Earth. But our reason to be on Earth is that unique consciousness that we then can give all others. So although we don't have a specialization, our specialization is in perfecting all of the other specializations. That's why netures were created. And that's why in Africa and amongst Native Americans and amongst many of the ancient civilizations, you have so much respect with nature, because they saw themselves as one with nature. And that as you developed yourself through nature and became part of nature, that you could have the all-seeing eye of the falcon. You could be able to smell like the dog. You would be able to have agility like the cat. You would have the essences of whatever they saw within the animal. So the animal has the specialization, but our specialization is to bring that specialization to perfectibility. That's our specialty. And it was a unique God concept that just happened to have come to us because of a situation that happened in the forests of Africa. On the 27th of December, you have birds fly and flowers bloom. When birds flew and flowers bloomed, dinosaurs perished, which is an interesting relationship, because if you find out why things start to blossom, you'll find out why things died. When you find out why things died, you'll understand why things blossom, because there's a nature, the law of polarity. When one door closes, another opens. This is the research that our children have to do, but we have to do it from our perspective, because it is obvious that Western perspective is not one with nature. And if you're not one with nature, you're not going to understand it. You will see it, but you will not know what you see. You will be conscious of it, but you will not be conscious that you're conscious of it, and that's the situation that we're in. We are sane people living in an insane society. And the only thing that can happen to a sane person when they try to define an insane situation is they go insane. What we need to do is redo our thinking and begin to look at it the way in which our ancestors did. And I'm not saying you have to go back and do what they did. I said the way in which they thought, the way in which they carried their lives is as applicable today as it was back then. I don't necessarily encourage to go back and build pyramids, but I do say let's take the math and the engineering that built the pyramids and see what we can do in the 21st century. On the 30th of December, the human ancestors living in Africa. Now, if I can just point to it on the map, because this is where we begin to look at things. Here in Africa, what you're really looking at when they talk about all of these continents at one time were connected. You can see how this part of Africa would have fit so neatly in here. You see how Madagascar here fits so perfectly in here. If you move Australia over, you'll see how all of this could have fit. If you condensed all of these continents into one, what we call it in science, we call it Pangaea. The ancient Kemites called it Ptah, the first hill that came up out of the waters of Nun. This is the story that we see here. So when we're looking at the history of the cosmos, what we're actually looking at is the fact that all of these continents were connected, and that Africa, rightly so, was in the middle. So if in fact Pangaea was one big mountain coming up out of this water, chances are it would have been this region right here in the center of the world, that's in the center of Africa, that would have been the highest point of that hill, and it is only sensible that life should have come from this area by the nature of science, whether you're dealing with climatology or biology or zoology or botany. It makes sense that that should happen. And one of the things that we'd really like to focus on today is just some of the ideas dealing with our ancestral line. And I do know that there are people who have problems looking at the role that, or the relationship that we have with gorillas, with the apes. But what we'd like to do is just talk about what we see. There was a tape done in July of 1995. It was narrated by our brother, Professor Avery Brooks, actor from Deep Space Nine, and also he's a professor at Harvard University in the drama department. And he had a three-part series where he talked about the Virunga Mountains. The Virunga Mountains are the home of the gorilla. You will not find gorillas anywhere in the world except in Central Africa. By that I mean the original mountain gorilla was born in the Virunga Mountains. The Virunga Mountains is this area right here. This is a relief map. Both of these are relief maps. And the one good thing about a relief map is that it is not a flat map. It in fact shows you, it has the ridges of mountains. It goes down into sea level. So you can actually see, the children, the students can feel what the mountains are like. So that when you look at this part of the world and you see the history and the story and you read the papyri of how the Kemites claim to have come from, originating from the foothills of the mountains of the moon, and the mountains of the moon here being Rwenzori, Kilimanjaro, and the Ethiopian highlands, the trinity of life. And if you look at them properly, they form, in a rough sort of way, a triangle. It is within here, let's just call them what we call them, because they are called Lake Edward. You have Lake Albert, Lake Edward, Lake Victoria, and then up here you have Tana. These are the rivers that accompany the mountains. In the papyrus of Hunefa, in the papyrus of Turin, Turin in Italy, there is said that the Kemites, the Egyptians, wrote that they originated at the foothills of the mountains of the moon, where the god Hapi, H-A-P-I, dwells. Now what's interesting is that one of the formations, one of the head forms of Hapi, in fact, is the head of what they call a baboon. Now, when you're talking about origins of life, when you're talking about origins of people, and when you know that there is a direct relationship in the family of what is known as primates, primates taking in a large number of different kinds of essences, and I call them essences because animal and human, somehow or other we have separated the word human from animal, but humans are animals. And it is hard because Western civilization is attempting in their supremic mentality to separate themselves from the animal world. I have no problem being an animal. I have no problem looking at myself as a descendant of animals or plants. Because when you're looking for truth, truth comes in a lot of ways. Because when you throw all of the nonsense away, we are not growing. Consciousness is growing. And every form that lives as we have lived, what is growing in us is not us per se, but our consciousness. And then through our consciousness, we are able to interact with our world around us. We are too busy thinking we are growing. We are not doing anything. Our consciousness is growing. And that is why the brain plays such an important role in the development of the higher forms of animals. And by higher forms, we're talking about intellect, reason, and language. That's what I mean. Now, in this Virunga Mountains, this three-part tape, Professor Brooks shows us the movement and how in the very beginning when Europe began to become aware of mountain gorillas and becoming aware of life in Africa, that they came here and they did a number of expeditions. But what I'd like to do, along with talking about this, is I just want to show you, because these are all books. This is called The Mountain Gorilla. And I just want to show you in this book a map of Africa and where you will find the mountain gorilla. Because this is where you will find the mountain gorilla. In this area right here, in the dark area. Here and coming down through here. You will not see, and the origins of the gorilla were here. The boundaries of Uganda, what we today call Congo, or then it was called Zaire, and Rwanda. Right in the cornerstone. Here, here's Uganda. Here's Uganda, Rwanda, Zaire, right here. These are the Virunga Mountain, and these are the Rwenzoris, all in this area. The Virunga Mountain area, and then you have the Rwenzori in this whole area of Uganda. So this is where you will only find gorillas. And then the mountain gorilla, through life, through time, traveled down out the mountains, and they flourished to the west, and they flourished east. And coming out of the mountains, these, what were mountain gorillas, are now today called eastern lowland, well, this would be western lowland and eastern lowland. Why? Because they left the mountains and went to the lower lands. Now, what is the difference between the mountain gorilla and the lowland gorillas? Well, there's a number of differences, but one of the main differences is weight. The mountain gorilla weighs up to 600 pounds. The lowland gorillas are about 450 pounds. So what is obviously happening is that as you moved out of the mountains and they were no longer mountainous, obviously their diet changed, their environment changed, and their structure changed that would make a 600-pound mountain gorilla become a 450-pound lowland gorilla. Now let's look at humanity, because right across you have humanity. Now, what is the question of the ape? Are we saying that are we descendants of the ape? Are we brothers of the ape? Are we cousins of the ape? There's a lot of things that we can say, but the research that we have done says that the ape, and the apes include the gibbon, the orangutan, the chimpanzee, and the gorilla. That is what we look at when we talk about the great apes. What we find is that bone for bone and muscle for muscle, gorillas and humans are almost exactly alike. And to show you that, I'd like to show you what it looks like, what the hands look like. The hands and the feet. We're dealing with gibbon, orangutan, chimpanzee, gorilla, human. What you will notice is that the hands are very much all alike. Where the real changes occur is in the feet. What you'll notice is that there's an opposable big toe. Some are far away, but when you get to the human, it comes up. And what we're looking at in terms of our history is that somewhere along the line, we and the great apes had a common ancestor. And what could have happened, and again, this is a theory, what could have happened, and what science shows us probably did happen, was that you have this major ancestor, but one of the brothers or sisters of this ancestor comes down and begins to live on the ground as opposed to living in a tree. And one of the things about the opposable toe, and chances are this ancestor had the opposable big toe, because the big toe, having an opposable big toe gives you 100% mobility. In other words, you can climb through trees using your hands or your feet because they all can grab, they all can latch on. So you have 100% mobility, but you have no stability. When this ancestor came out of the tree, for whatever reason, maybe they saw some food on the ground, they might have fallen out of the tree. And maybe they didn't get up, maybe they just kind of looked around, investigated a while, and then down the road came down again, and then pretty soon came down again. Somewhere in the history, over hundreds of, if not thousands of years, this ancestor that came down out the tree stayed out of the tree. But in so doing, they kept stepping on their opposable big toe. So they had to keep finding themselves flipping over that big toe so that it would be flat, so as they walked, they wouldn't have to step on their opposable toe. And pretty soon, after having staying on the land and forcing this toe to come, this toe, through generations, began to be born closer attached to the foot itself. And then at that point, our ancestor lost 50% mobility and gained 50% stability. So we had 50% mobility because we could do things with our hands, and we had 50% stability, which meant that we could walk on the earth. But we still were walking hunched over. Because remember, we have not yet become Homo erectus, and erectus is the form of human that moves from, when we used to walk, we used to leave what we call gorilla, we call them knuckle prints. Not just footprints, but knuckle prints, because we would walk like this. Somewhere along the line, we rose up off like this. So not only did we have this ability, but we also had, prior to Homo erectus, was Homo habilis, who made tools. So in half, mountain gorilla came also. And it's important for us to be able to see this and make this connection, because we see things happening now and we think they were always around. I'm sure that when I said earlier that the European, as we know them, is no older than 10,000 years, and many people are shocked. But it can be proven. And again, let's not move into emotion or feelings, and let's look at what was found. And let's go back to the late 1800s in a place near, around France, Italy, Spain, in this area here. It's called Monaco. Today is ruled by a family known as Grimaldi. You have Prince Albert, you have the other ones, that you have Princess Grace, who was married to the Prince of Monaco. His name is Grimaldi. And so this family is what we're talking about. Well, in this area of Monaco, in the late 1800s, they were excavating for construction. And they came upon bones. And immediately they saw that they were human bones, and they stopped work on this particular site. They went to the government and explained to the government what they had come upon, and the government closed the site, and they sent anthropologists, historians, geographers, linguists, major areas of scholarship into this area to study what was found. And what they found, they called Cro-Magnon, C-R-O-M-A-G-N-O-N. They called it Cro-Magnon man. They continued excavation in this area. This Cro-Magnon man, by the way, was neither European nor African, but a very interesting combination of both. Somatologically, which we're talking about blood, body structure in terms of the shape of the head, the brow ridge, the cheekbones, the eyes, where they were placed on the head, the length of the arms. All of this was not like the European's body. It was not like the African's body either, but it was closer to the African than it was to the European. They continued until they came upon a place known as Grottes des Enfants, which means the grotto of the children, or the children's cave. In this children's cave, they found a body that was very much like the other body that they found, Cro-Magnon, that mixture, closer to the African, but on a mutated stage. This individual obviously had mutated itself. What they did was that they began to dig and dig and dig. And what they came upon in this area, the children's cave, with the Cro-Magnon on top, they went down 12 levels. They went down from 12 to 11. That was one stage, and then 2 stage, 3 stage, 4 stage, 5, until they went to 12. Well, as they were going down the first stage, the second stage, the third stage, the fourth stage, when they got to the 9th stage, they came upon an interesting find. They came upon, in Monaco, a baby and an old woman. And these two essences were found buried it was obviously that they had gone through a particular ritual. They were not just buried there. They seem to have been, well, some people say they seem to have been killed and they were just left there. But whatever it was, this one that was down 9 levels was so different. And by the way, what separated each layer was maybe a couple of thousand years. The one they found way down on the 9th level was so different from the one they found on top that they had to give it another name, and they called it Grimaldi. They named it after the family. They called it Grimaldi. This Grimaldi, bone for bone, structure for structure, it was an African woman and an African child. Now, if this is true, what I do with children, what I do with people is I get a box, and I have everybody date a piece of paper and write a message on the box. And we put that message, and then I put a piece of paper over everybody's messages. Next time we write another message, and we date it, and we put it, and then I put another. And each time I put some across, it's like a stratified layer. Mm-hmm. And then what we do is after we do 12, I go back and we start to go from top to bottom. By the time we get to the 9th layer, I ask them, which did we write first? And of course the answer is always the 9th as opposed to the one that was way up on the top. So if that is true, the essence that was found on top came much later than what was found on the very bottom, and what was walking the streets and the lands of Europe thousands of years before this mutated Cro-Magnon came into existence was an African people, found surrounding this African culture was what is known as the Aurignacian tool. Now, the Aurignacian tool is very important in the fact that the Aurignacian culture, tool culture in Europe, seems to be born overnight. You cannot give birth to anything overnight. You've got to go through trial and error. So obviously, Africans must have brought this culture into Europe. It wasn't born in Europe. If in fact this Aurignacian culture was not born in Europe, it means that the civilization brought into Europe was not indigenous to Europe, but indigenous in Africa and then brought to Europe. Now, this is scientific evidence. Now, anyone that has anything else that could possibly change that, I invite anyone, because I'm trying to find out the truth here. And so far, truth tells me that because Cro-Magnon was dated approximately between 20 and 10,000 years, it means that that wasn't what the European is today. So if that wasn't what the European is today, the European must have mutated itself within that Cro-Magnon, which means that they must have come long after, between 10 and 20,000 years ago. So the evidence of life coming out of Africa, coming into Europe, but not just that, but civilization was brought into Europe. Europe did not invent civilization. It was brought into Europe, and Africans who were mutating themselves became civilized by the more civilized Africans coming into Europe. And then over the thousands of years, this helped them survive, which eventually meant that when the Ice Age ended, the Worm Ice Age ended, it meant that these Africans now, the ice mountains melted, and then they began to return further south.
Why didn't they start returning further south before?
Because there were ice mountains.
So they couldn't get
They couldn't get past. It's like an ice mountain going across Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, or Webster Avenue in the Bronx, or Malcolm X Boulevard. You can't get from east to west if there's a huge ice mountain in front of you. And there's no way to climb an ice mountain because you'll slip. It's not like a earth mountain. It's more like just an ice barrier, a big wall that just did not allow peoples to return back. And in their desperate need to survive, instead of trying to run away, they said it's better to retreat into caves. And it is there that they lived for thousands of years, with clothes on because it's cold. And I encourage you to read a book, The Making of the White Man, by Paul Guthrie, because he shows and he talks about, through documentation, the writings of people living in old Europe, talking about who they saw coming down out these mountains approximately 2,000 years before the Christian era. These barbarians and these savages. These were the ancestors of the peoples that would overrun the Roman Empire. These are the ancestors who would eventually go into Spain. These also are the ancestors that the Moors would chase out of Spain also. The Visigoths, the Vandals, all coming from Germany, Sweden, Norway. That's why the further north you go, the blonder blue eye you become. The more transparent the skin you become. As you travel further south, even in Europe, you get darker in Europe. That is why there's such a challenge in Italy between the southern Italian and the northern Italian. Because complexion-wise, there's a large difference between these two Italian peoples. And why? Because when these individuals were going, these people came down and part of their tribes went west and part went east. The ones that went west were the Visigoths, and the ones that went down into Italy became the Ostrogoths. It was the Ostrogoths who Shakespeare talks about, who Othello was fighting. That is why we find a black man in Venice. What's a black man doing in Venice in Shakespeare's writing? It is obvious that the Moors coming in this area had great control over this area. So it's important that as we break this down and we look at this history, that we do not deny any part of us. And this is why understanding and knowing nature is so important. And it is important for me to look at the gorilla, to look at primates, of which we are a member of the primate family. It is important for us to begin to look at creation and evolution. It's important to look at transformation, because if we don't see transformation, we will not see the God concept in us, and we will not be able to give to our children what we can, because we will not see that every generation gets better in time. And it is meant to be. God is not finished with us yet. There are yet unlimited levels. We are at the Homo sapiens sapiens stage. But there are many other levels to go. In fact, I believe that our ancestors were beyond Homo sapiens sapien at one time, And I believe that this impact has dragged us back down to Homo sapiens sapiens. And if we're not careful, we will get like Western civilization. And I believe that they have already reverted back into the Neanderthal. I believe that mentally they never moved beyond that level of Neanderthal. And the difference between a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens sapien is sharing. The concept of sharing, the concept of honor through word. You see, the reason why we have to sign contracts is because fundamentally we don't trust each other. In Africa, you never had to sign anything because your word was your bond. And for you to go against your word brought more devastation than breaking a contract. So that's what ushered in civilization, was the act of sharing, the act of community, the act of looking at a greater good that we all aspire for. As a Neanderthal, we were all about ourselves. We were all about that next meal. As a Homo sapiens sapien, we stopped and wondered and said, it is good for all of us to survive. So instead of us fighting over one piece of food, let us all share that one piece of food, because we will all eat forever, because the next time you get something to eat, we'll all eat again. But I know that if I were in a group of 7 people and the mightiest of the group ate all the food, I know that I would fight to become the mightiest of the people so I could get the food. In Africa, it didn't make a difference because we all shared. And nature itself gave us things to share. And we always knew that where our next meal would come from.
Now, can we go back and begin to look at the first great civilizations and where they formed and kind of who formed them or how they formed, etc. And some of the evidence that deals with them, like the Shabaka stone,
Yes.
where people were about what time different things begin to happen, like farming, agriculture, stuff of that nature. Let's look at the progression and evolution of these people.
Sure. And you know, it's interesting that that should come, because just like there's a disadvantage in the cold, there's also a disadvantage in the hot. And the reason why I say that is because it is my belief, in looking at what was developed as far as the pyramids were concerned, the temples, the Monomotapa Empire, the empires of West Africa. It is my belief that as our ancestors, and this is really what my movement, my reason for all of this is that for our children and our children's children. Mm-hmm. Because right now we still are using Western mentality to decipher many things. Mm-hmm. When we give to our children another mode of looking at the world, we then will be able to look at things that we can't right now. Like, for instance, research shows us that there are underground tunnels that some say link East Africa and West Africa. And the reason why there are tunnels is because when the Sahara began to form, because it's important to know that in this part of the world that today is desert, at one time this flourished. This was green, this had all sorts of foods and all sorts of different growing activities, and organic life flourished here. But then with the movement of the earth and whatever other earthly activities occurred, this began to dry up and become a desert. But there was a lively trade going on for centuries amongst the Africans in this part of the world. So instead of going above the ground, which was very hot, they began to build tunnels underground. And every so often, to get some fresh air and to get some food or a different kind of food, they would come up out of the hole. Today we call these pit stops oases. And all across this area you will find oases. These were like when you're on the road going from, let's say, New York to Boston, and you stop at one of those little places to eat. That was equivalent to what an oasis was. It was a pit stop where people from underground could go. And these underground tunnels were quite huge. And it is my belief, as others have said, that I've listened to, that is probably where the idea for any tunnel or even for the subway system came about. By studying these tunnels. And these tunnels, by the way, were seen from the spaceships taking X-rays of the Earth. So this is not even something that was done on the Earth. This was done from the sky down onto the Earth. But the original peoples that we're talking about are short-statured people. We're talking about a people that range anywhere from 3 foot 2 inches to about 4 foot 8 inches. These were the first peoples that just went straight across the Earth. These today called the Twa people, the Mbuti, derogatorily called Pygmy. These peoples are the original peoples here in this area here that moved about. I'm concerned about talking about early civilizations because I believe that under the pyramids are many other civilizations. And that every civilization, just like when we looked at the stratified layers in Europe of people, I believe that there are stratified layers in Africa. And as we, as a people, dig deeper, as our children and our children's great-grandchildren dig deeper, we will find that Africa goes back many, many, many more million years. That humanity living in Africa is not 3.2 million years old, but in fact could be 130 million years old. And that built underneath what we seem to be could be worlds and civilizations that have yet to be understood, and the whole aspect of where they came from as a people, what they developed, could go beyond. I believe that's what Star Wars was about. That was the retelling of our story. When you look at Darth Vader, of course, Vader meaning father, and Darth a derivative of dark, Darth Vader being Dark Father. You have Obi-Wan Kenobi dressed in all white. You have Darth Vader dressed in black. And then you have Luke Skywalker, the heroine factor, the Falcon. Except they twisted the story around. So Luke fights his father. He doesn't know it's his father. He's fighting the person he thinks killed his father. But in fact, his father killed his uncle. The Osarian drama is the exact opposite. The son fights the uncle to pay back for him killing his father. The Star Wars saga turns the whole story inside out, inverses the meaning, and then we don't know that that's our story today. The pyramids of ancient Kemet, the Namuratunga stars that are found here in Africa. There is a whole area here that is found, it's called Namuratunga. And here in Namuratunga, which is somewhere between Kenya and Ethiopia, today it's the Konso people, in this area right here, we find that these Africans, 2,285 years BC, give or take a couple of thousand years, were actually studying 7 major star systems in 4 major constellations. When you look at these star formations, they literally create a serpent in the sky. When you start with Sirius, from Sirius you go to Central Orion to Saiph, which is also in Orion. You go to Bellatrix, to Aldebaran, to Pleiades, and then to Triangulum. These are 4 constellations. You have the constellation of Canis Major, which has Sirius, and then you have the Orion, which has Saiph, S-A-I-P-H. You have Central Orion, and you have Bellatrix, which is all in Orion. And then you go from Orion to Taurus. Taurus has Aldebaran, and it has the Pleiades, which are known as 7 sisters. And then you have the Triangulum. When you look at Triangulum, the Triangulum in a southeast December sky points east in the sky. There are many reasons why we know and understand. Why would they create the Namuratunga stars? Why would they then move up through this area, perfecting the steles, perfecting lines of sight until they get to Egypt, where they can actually prophesize through constellation study the way of the world? There has to be a direct pattern here. There had to have been a deep knowledge of things that even we don't touch today. The Dogon of Mali, the Dogon that live in this area right up in here, the Dogon, they knew things about Sirius that the Europeans wouldn't even see until 1970. Now, how could that be? How could they see a star? How could they define a star as Kiziuzi? How could they know that it was the smallest in the sky, yet it was the densest? In other words, if you took a thimbleful of land from Sirius B, it would weigh about 80,000 pounds. We're talking about a thimble, and we're talking about a denseness of what is known as a dwarf star or a black star that is so compressed, its nucleuses of its electrons are so compressed that it has become, through just pressure constantly, just as dense, about a quarter the size of the Earth. Yet, if you took a thimbleful, it would weigh 80,000 pounds. How did they know this? They went up there. Wait, talking about? Well, let me tell you what happened. There were 2 French, Dieterline, female, and Griot, a man. Marcel Driot, in 1931, sat with Ogatameli, who was an elder of one of the 4 families of Dogon, and through permission of the Council of Elders, Ogatameli brought these 2 French through a partial understanding of Dogon cosmology. They brought these 2 Europeans from France into a room that had 12 chairs. And in each of these chairs, they had a mask. It's called a Kanaga mask, K-A-N-A-G-A. And they said that every 60 years, Sirius B, well, every 50 years, Sirius B makes a complete rotation around Sirius A. Mm-hmm. Every 60 years, they had a celebration involving this revolution. For this 60-year celebration, every 60 years, they made 1 Kanaga mask. And after the celebration, they would put it on a chair.
Right.
In this room, there were 12 chairs with 12 masks.
Right.
If you multiply 60 times 12, you get approximately 720.
Right.
If you subtract 720 from 1931, you get 1211, which would have been right at the point of a very important time in terms of the West African dynasties, in particular Timbuktu. They said they had 3 other rooms like that. So now think of what we're saying here. They knew that this star existed. This star that Europeans wouldn't see until 1970, Dogon saw in 1211 AD. And that's the physical proof. They had 2 other rooms. But I have a feeling they had many more rooms, because they're not going to tell them everything. By the way, the same sect of Dogon have not been looked upon kindly by the other 3 sects because they told them too much. And Ogatameli said, but I told them nothing. And they turned back and said, even that, you told them too much. So that what we're looking at is the dynamics of what, I'm not impressed with what the Dogon told them. I'm impressed with what they didn't tell them. Because if in 1211 they knew that Sirius B, Kizi Uzi, they had a name for it. They knew it was the smallest sky, but they also knew that our Milky Way galaxy revolved around it, which chances are what they were talking about was our particular cluster that our galaxy is in. Which means that if they understood that our planet in relationship to our star is the same relationship as our star to Sirius, they knew Sirius revolved around something. They must have also known superclusters. They may not have called them superclusters, but they knew that everything came out of something else and distanced itself, because when Ogatameli was drawing things in the ground, he would show by movement the concept of distancing things, which means that you have Kizi Uzi, the seed, as the center, and then you have this explosion from this encasement that throws out of itself all of its being, so that in fact the conversion of energy, potential energy, to kinetic energy was in fact the implosion of Kizi Uzi. How did they know this? That is deep. That is not only deep science. To get to that point took thousands of years to see that. You just don't get to that point of brilliance. You know, 1211, you can even take it back further than that if you want to. But let's just be conservative and say there was but 1 room. Even 1211, they would have to have studied this thousands of years to even get to that point at 1211. So their brilliance wasn't at 1211. It in fact crystallized at 1211, but in fact was in the making maybe 50,000 BC. Because I don't believe anything that's out here. I don't believe what they say. They're not accurate. They're not accurate to tell me that China is the largest continent on Earth when I happen to know, and we all know, that most of Asia is ice. If it melted, that wouldn't be land. Africa is the largest landmass on Earth. They're going to tell me that China has the most people on the planet, yet they can't even get the census right in the Bronx. Yet they've gone into the Ituri forest and counted every African. I don't think so. And I think that we have got to start Kuchichagulia. We've got to start to define for ourselves the parameters and the boundaries of our thought. And we, like Kizzy Uzi, have to break out through an implosion the encasement that Western civilization has encapsulated us in. We are like whales living in a fishbowl. Our minds, our children's mind, this is something I find about in our children in school, because I work with children pre-K through 8th grade. One of the problems that our children have is that they're trying to get deeper than the teacher can get. And because this civilization has not taught the depth of the metaphor, they're giving back nonsense. They know it's nonsense, and they act nonsensical because of nonsense. This is shallow out here. What we teach our children, what we ourselves have been taught, is shallow. If we were to look at the Dogon way of educating and go from Jiri So, which is the shallow level, to Beni So, which is a little bit deeper in understanding, to Bolo So, which is a little bit deeper, and then the So Dai, I think we just began Jiri So. We're not even at Jiri So. We are at the introduction of Jiri So. The Jiri So to the Dogon was the word in the front, the word that you see in front of you, the shallowness, just your perception. Beni So becomes the words on the side, becomes deeper. So not only do you know the shallow, but you know the words on the side. Bolo So becomes the word in the back, which means that not only do you have the word in the front, not only do you have the word on the side, but you've been gifted with a deeper version of what you can't see. But when you get real deep, then you get the internal word, the clear word, the spirit word. We are not only aren't we in the back word, well, first of all, not only don't we have the spiritual word, we don't have the back word or the side word, and we're barely perceiving what we see in front of us. That's the problem, and we are allowing people who know not better to tell us, and we believe them. We have to start our own schools. We have to look at this material. Don't be afraid of the mountain gorilla. Last time I checked in the Bronx Zoo, the gorilla asked me, what make you think I want to be related to you? So who are we to be so arrogant to think that this is a lowly creature? At least a gorilla knows what to eat. If you threw a Big Mac in a gorilla cage, a gorilla would take out the lettuce, brush off the mayonnaise, and throw everything else back out the cage. Because they know better than to eat meat. They know that's not part. The gorilla knows how to live. The gorilla is one of the most peaceful animals in the world. Now you have this 600-pound gorilla. Peaceful gorilla. Don't fight. A gorilla is the most peaceful animal in the world. Shy, won't mess with you, will playfully tap you. I remember in one of the films, I don't know if it's in Twilight of the Gorilla or if it's in Professor Brooks's work of Virunga, Fire and Ice, but a gorilla is playing with one of the people who have come to see him, and he just kind of goes to just tap him to play with him. He knocks him down the hill. And he was just tapping him like that. He didn't mean harm, but that's how strong a gorilla is. A gorilla won't put his hands on you, won't fight you, will leave you alone. They did an experiment where they force-fed a gorilla meat. By the afternoon, the gorilla was fighting with the other gorillas in the cage. Because gorillas don't eat meat, and meat makes you violent by the nature of cannibalism. Gorillas don't eat meat. They eat leaves, and when you travel into their world, at best they will eat ants or little things crawling, but they will not eat. And by the way, they don't like bananas, which is very interesting because, you know, we got that thing from King Kong and Mighty Joe Young. Gorillas don't eat bananas. They eat green things. They eat leaves. They don't eat bananas. That has become a story that we've given because bananas are tropical and things like that. But a gorilla is a wonderful, and when you study the secrets of the gorilla, you find out things about yourself. So I am not ashamed to look at the gorilla as part of my family. I have no problem reading these books. These are books that I've gotten. I've got tapes. For children, I got a book called One Gorilla, which is a great math book. And it teaches a lot about gorillas, but at the same time it teaches about math. So we have books that deal with gorilla. I also have a book that's called Bitter Bananas that deals with gorillas. And you know, I know it's a very controversial area. I really don't talk about it too much in school because there's so much to talk about. And there's so many of us who are deeply rooted in the Christian and the Judaic tradition that we don't like to talk about that. But you know, really, the whole reason why we try to stay away from the nature of who we are is because we know that Europeans know that if you get into the nature of who you are, and if you understand your relationship with the gorilla, with the great apes, you have to know that you came from Africa. There's no way that you could escape that. And so they keep you afraid of embracing, because again, whether you like it or not. I'll just show this to you one more time so you can see, because I want you to see a gorilla's hand and your hand. Bone for bone. Muscle for muscle. Every organ, every gland, 99.9% of what humans do, gorillas can do. And they're doing research now showing that gorillas are now at the point where they're even talking to each other and in fact talking to other humans. This is and in time, over millions of years, if we don't act right, they may be the next form of life to have reason, intellect, and language. So we better be careful, because looking at the 6 different forms of humanity that we know of as today, we saw them off. There are no more Homo sapiens on Earth except for some people of Western mindset. I believe that's still very deeply Neanderthal. Some of them have not reached their pineal gland has not activated. Although they have the space, they don't have the percolation. They don't have the melanic structure in the cerebrospinal fluid. There's a lot within their cerebrospinal fluid. And the thing about the cerebrospinal fluid is that when an organism, particularly the human, is born, you are born, you have what is known as the ventricle system. I remember my mother used to say growing up, when I would act out, she'd say, you're acting like you have a hole in your head. Well, actually, ventricles are holes in your head. You have 4. And in these ventricles, in these holes, you have 2 that are called lateral ventricles. And then you have one that comes down that is the meeting point of the 2 lateral that becomes the 3rd ventricle. And then the 3rd ventricle then comes down through the brain and through that whole structure, and that becomes the 4th ventricle. Now, through these, you have a number of different openings that send out the cerebrospinal fluid that then bathes your skull. It's the distance between your skull and your brain, because when you bang your head, what stops your brain from hitting your skull is that it's resting in this fluid. Your brain literally is swimming in this cerebrospinal fluid, along with it bathing and going down through all of your ventricles, down through your central nervous system, and then out through your entire system. The cerebrospinal fluid is the Christic oil, by the way. Christ being oil. Well, cerebrospinal fluid is that oil. It is that liquid. It is made up of what the world is made of. It is made of, it has a salty taste to it. It is in fact the ocean that your body is, and your body depends on it. And inside, as it coats your body, it's at the same time sending messages and receiving messages. So that when you meditate, you notice there's the letter M plays a very important role. So you have when you what you're doing is you're percolating your cerebrospinal fluid. As you percolate that water, it brings you to levels of consciousness. This is what ushered in the higher levels of thought process or consciousness in humans. And that's what separates gorillas from humans. It's the only thing. Once they start percolating their cerebrospinal fluid, we're in trouble. Because there's nothing that would stop them from becoming who we are not. And it's important that we know this. If we don't know our relationship with them, if we continue to look at it through Western eyes, we will continue to miss out. That's why they call it the missing link. It's not that it's missing, it's that it's being withheld. Because the missing link is our ancestor. The missing link, a link brings 2 things together. What is the missing link is the ancestor that brings the great apes and humans into one family. When we find that out, some people have called it the form that is known as Ramapithecus. There are others like Dr. Obenga and Dr. Diop that says, let's hold on calling it Ramapithecus because Ramapithecus is showing that it hadn't reached certain levels. But we're talking approximately 25 million years ago, give or take. Again, everything I say, as far as I'm concerned, be careful with dates. I like chronology. In other words, one thing leading to another leads to a common sense approach to things. I'm not deep into telling you dates because I'm telling you, we're going back many more million years. Research is showing us that there are things under the pyramids. There are civilizations under the pyramids. That there are things under the Great Lakes region. That in fact, we could have gone through this process of life a couple of times and died out like the dinosaurs did. There's no reason why that's not true because none of us has gotten to the earth crust yet. Because inside that is the molten liquid from whence we all are. Inside the earth, there is the equivalent that is known as Kizi-Uzi. It is the central fire that in its encasement exploded and sent things out into its different directions. And what that means is that the center of the earth to the land itself is equivalent to Kizi-Uzi and the cosmic universe. That in the earth you have that concept of the core. But coming out of the core you have all of the other things that made up the earth. So the boundaries of the earth become the encasement of how far the core had the implosion. If you go to the star, then you're looking at, if you go to the sun, then our solar system, with Neptune being the furthest planet from the sun, becomes the boundaries of our solar system. Then when you look at Kizi-Uzi, you have another boundary. And then you go to the cluster, you have another boundary. Then you go to supercluster, you have another boundary. Everything has its boundary, but what's the most important is the seed of the seed. And in us, in every one of us, there's a seed that makes us who we are. And that is the atom of our DNA. And that DNA atom is to our whole body as the earth core is to the earth. As our galaxy is to Kizi-Uzi. As Kizi-Uzi is to its cluster. As its cluster is to the supercluster. And as the supercluster is to the cosmic universe. And as the cosmic universe is to the universe. There is a pattern in the tabernacle. And as an African people, when we study this, you cannot know yourself and not know the gorilla. Whether you like what I'm saying or not. That's the bottom line. Just like whether you like your grandmother or your grandfather or not, you can't know your family if you don't know them. You can choose not to want to know them. But that means that you will forever not know part of yourself. Whether you like it or not. The gorilla is part of our life. Whether we like it or not. We must embrace our concept and love the gorilla, because had it not been for our family, we wouldn't be here today. We all made this possible. And it's important that we look at it that way and not have the mindset of Western civilization, which is xenophobia. And by the way, if you shaved a gorilla, you know a gorilla would be white.
Just like a white man.
Just like a white man. See, the evidence of melanin on the organism is that the hair is black. When we started to shed our hair, the skin underneath, you see, his skin can't be black because the black hair protects the skin. The skin is white. And if you want to know, just look underneath the underarm of a gorilla. You'll see that it's white. When this gorilla began, or I shouldn't say, when the ancestor that would give birth to us began to lose its hair because of its movement around, it had to make up for protection of the skin. So as the hair began to move away and to fall out, the skin turned black. And that's how the origin of the African man and woman, the dark complexion man and woman, by Glosier's law that says any essence born within a tropical region must be deeply pigmented, or else it cannot survive. That's how you know when you saw the mummy, and you saw that light complexion man running around up there with nothing on his top, and nothing, you know that can't be true. Scientifically, any European that walked in Egypt in that heat, that complexion, would die of melanoma by 14 years of age.
But,
Skin cancer.
Why can they do it now?
They can't do it now.
Whites
They can't do
survive
it.
in Egypt now.
No, they're in and out. That's why they got those umbrellas. That's why they stay most times indoors. They wear clothes.
The Arabs.
They have hats.
The Arabs.
Arabs are black. To be an Arab, you must be black. You can't be an Arab and not be black. What made Eurasians Arabs was they mated with blacks. I don't call them Arabs. I call them Afrabs. You cannot be an Arab without being black. You cannot be Jewish without being black. The whole concept of, in fact, there is no such thing as a Semitic people. Semite is a language. Semite means mixture, semi. Part African, part Eurasian. The Semitic language is the language that these Eurasians took on. They differentiated in their own way, developed two different religions around it, but both are based in Africa. The language structure is based in the African language. So Arabs, and by the way, the lighter complexion Arabs must be fully clothed. That's why they wear all those clothes. It had nothing to do with modesty. It has to do with the fact that if you're not covered up, you are going to die of skin cancer. So Arabs survive, first of all, because they're black. And just like African Americans survive in heat, Arabs survive in heat. Because African Americans and Arabs are the same. It's all according to the Eurasian. Because remember, Dr. Diop teaches us, there are only two groups of people. There's the southern cradle and the northern cradle. The southern cradle, the northern cradle. At some point in time, these northern Africans, after depigmenting themselves, came down into this area here. Those that were over here became what we today call Asians. Those that came from here, they basically are the Europeans, but they're all the same people. But what made these individuals come down through this area and travel across here today are the Arabs, because before Muhammad, blessings on that brother's name, there were no Arabs. They were all scattered tribes with no language, by the way. They had no real language. They took on the language of whatever locality they were around. And these were African people, of course, dark complexion, with the mixtures of the Eurasians that had come down since the melting of the ice. But these individuals themselves, they themselves came about through being black. And they survived very limited wise. And also, by the way, they are also getting different forms of skin cancer.
Now, I want to go back and look at, to some degree, why those Africans coming out of the European areas, coming down these Asians later on, was so different from the Africans who they encountered and overcame. But before we get there, I want to progress there. I want to look at what was going on in Africa that made Africa, and especially the Nile Valley, such a dynamic civilization. I mean, if we can look at the Shabaka stone, if we can talk about what they were doing in terms of their spirituality. You talked about that pineal gland and the whites not having it. Perhaps there's a connection that you can bring that in as you talk.
I think that when we're looking at Africa, in particular, the Happy Valley or the Nile River, Happy River. We don't call it Nile, we call it Happy. What we see is that there's constant movement of peoples, and they are bringing thought processes. They are constantly attempting to answer the question of questions. How did I get here? And once I find out how I got here, what do I do to make it better? These were the questions. These are fundamental. So when Shakespeare said the question is to be or not to be, that's exactly what the question is: to be or not to be. These Africans were developing dynamic civilization based on a natural foundation. Basing it on a natural foundation, you immediately develop an understanding of a God concept. In understanding this God concept and an understanding, and I just ask you to think about the kind of, if you've been in a situation where if you have a home or if you don't have a home, but think about being in a place that you don't have to worry about paying rent. You don't have anybody coming to you taking anything from you. I'm not saying in the sense of stealing, I'm just saying that there are things that you know are you. They are yours. And all around the land you have a number of different people who are living with you. And you're in the sun. You're in the kind of weather that we have in the summertime. And like I said before, we spoke about having a tree. And down a neighbor got some cashews, and another neighbor has pistachios, and some others have berries, and I have apples, and you have oranges. And well, what we do is that we just walk around, and every Saturday we all decide, look, I'm going to give you a piece of what I have. Everybody's going to give a piece of what they have. And we're going to share. well, there becomes a relationship between these people that is communal. And there is not about, okay, I'm going to see if I can, I'm going to give him 4 oranges, but I'm going to try to get a couple of pounds of pistachio. In other words, I'm going to try to get a better deal from him that he's going to get from me. That concept is not there. The concept is, let us all work together. In fact, your idea is to make it so that everything is so equal that there is a balance and a harmony within the community. And that you know that nature has been so loving to you that even when you don't know if the fruit is ripe, you can stand underneath a tree and the mango will fall in your hand. When it is ready, it'll fall out and let you know. That's how wonderful nature is. This kind of prophetic life on nature's level becomes the way in which we live as a people. Therefore, there's no reason for me to try to shortchange somebody, try to mess with people, try to take something, because I know that if I do, then maybe the forces will not give me. That's my mentality. My mentality is eating the right foods, associating with the right people, communal living, and trust. I can go to sleep and know that my neighbor has my back. I don't need windows because no one's going to climb in. So therefore, everything is open. It would create a mindset in you. Now, think about another setting. Think about a setting where there are no trees that give fruit. You don't know where your next meal is coming from. And you know that if you're holding a sheep that you're about to eat, you know that every human being around you is your enemy, because each and every one of them wants what you have. It creates a mentality that hoards. You hold your stuff here and you put your boundaries around that. You don't let anybody in. It means that if they had their chance, because of the nature of survival, that if they are hungry, they're willing to do something to you to get what you have. Imagine not having food, not being able to trust people, and never sharing. You're an African too, by the way. You're not. Imagine that mindset that's created there. Imagine being in the cold, where you have to put clothes on, where you sneeze and you get sick. You see, Africans don't have communicative disease. Communicative diseases came from Europe. The common cold is not African. A communicable disease is a disease that you communicate to other people. In other words, if I sneezed in this room and other people got sick, in Africa, that didn't exist until the European came in contact and communicated their disease. Venereal disease didn't exist in Africa. Venereal diseases didn't exist in Africa. That's a communicable disease. We started getting communicable diseases when we came in contact with Europeans. I'm not saying that we may not have had reproductive problems. In humanity, you will always have that. But we did not have the communicative diseases, the communicable diseases that we would give to another person. TB and things like that. That didn't exist in that. We got sick from what invaded us, the tsetse fly. We got sick from the bugs that would give us malaria. Things that came from the outside infected us. But the European, because of the nature of the cold and because of the lack of eating and because of the stress level, they started to get sick inside and could send it out. Africans don't get sick inside and send things out. And I'm not talking about superiority or inferiority. I am just saying that in the wintertime, we tend to get sicker than when we are in the warm weather, because the sun has like it is like a healing. You know, if you're sick, you get into the sun can draw the poisons out.
Now you're talking about before, not today, because today Africans have everything.
Oh, absolutely, because they have communicated their diseases to us. But if you go into parts of Africa that have not been contaminated, they do not have communicable diseases. Venereal disease doesn't exist. In parts of Africa that have not been impacted by Europeans, they don't have the common cold. Native Americans didn't have the common cold. Native Americans didn't have communicable diseases. They got communicable diseases when the Europeans came.
That's why we were wiped out so easy.
That's right. And yes, exactly. Because they did not, their immune system was not based on being able to fight what was coming in. And so peoples who did not have communicable diseases, and it's not that they didn't get sick, because something you eat could get you sick, but what you ate was something that was external that came inside.
and made you sick. What Europeans, they are sick inside, and they communicate that illness out. Until the old world came in contact with the new world, communicable diseases didn't exist. So in this ice, in this cold, in this lack of food, the immune system broke down. When the immune system broke down, anything that happened on the inside could become permanent damage, and that was the beginning of the communicable disease. Africa doesn't have that. They do now, because that disease has been communicated. And once it's communicated, you can pass it on. But if you got sick in Africa, you'd get better sooner than if you get sick in Europe. Because the sun has that ability to just go all around you and just massage you and make you better. It has healing properties. And so you can imagine that this individual getting sicker, the immune system breaking down, the level of stress and pain and mistrust against each other, the misunderstanding. This African gained a kind of perception that was a little bit off balance. Not to mention the fact that in the absolute cold and in the darkness and in the cave, the pineal gland began to calcify. Calcification, if I can give you an analogy, a calcified pineal gland, okay, let me say, a healthy pineal gland looks like a grape, a small grape, oval in shape. A calcified pineal gland looks like a raisin. A raisin is a grape that has had its water, its hydro properties, sucked out of it. A pineal gland is a gland that has had its spiritual waters sucked out of it. Therefore, their perceptions of a spiritual nature are dimmed. Their perception of a love ethic is dimmed. They couldn't care less if they took their mother off to get the meal. It's created a mindset of anger, stress, meanness. And so that when this calcified pineal gland, encased in this depigmented body, returned back to the southern lands, they did not have the same mindset that these Africans and these peoples of the southern lands had. So when these people came down and people started to share with them, these folk of European descent, having not had for so long, looked at sharing as weakness and lied, cheated, and stole. Why? Because in their development, that's what they did. And they have no problem developing that kind of mindset. And I think that one of the things that's so important as we develop this understanding is to know that these people of European descent are in fact Africans who have been bleached.
Now, I just want to look at African culture, and you just explained it. But are you saying that there were not great wars? Africans were not fighting among themselves, etc.?
No.
To explain that.
No.
European. So give me a time period of what we're talking about. And you're saying that Africa did not have wars among itself?
No, I think they did, and I think they had anger, and I think they fought, and I think that there were peoples who had not developed themselves on higher levels of consciousness. Dr. Van Sertima talks about a point that whenever Africans are showed, they always show the Africans that had not risen to higher civilizations. And there are those that have not. Not because of superior or inferior, but because of the environment around them did not give them an opportunity to tap into certain things that other nations did. So I'm not trying to say that. However, there is a big difference because there were many that were very highly developed. And really what I would like to stress more than anything else is that yes, Africans have good and bad. They have their heroes and they have their villains. I'm not trying to say it didn't exist. It did exist, but it wasn't a code of conduct. When you look at Egyptian history, you look at a dynastic period. The timeline of Egypt is the pharaonic dynasties. If you look at European history, and I have a master's in European history, the timeline are wars. When I teach social studies, we start at the first war. Whether you go back to Greece or to Rome,
with Spartacus and all of the gladiators. You have nothing but Greek city-states fighting themselves. The Romans, of course, doing their thing. Then, of course, from Rome, you have the Visigoths and the Vandals. From the Visigoths and Vandals, you then have Columbus. From Columbus, then, you have the French and British fighting. You have the Dutch fighting. You have every group fighting. Then you get to 1900, you have World War I, World War II, the Korea, Vietnam, Russia. When Europe's not in hot wars, they create cold wars. They are constantly at war. Their timeline in social studies, you do by wars. There is no cultural or civilizing impact that you go from one consciousness to another. What separates European history from each other? Wars. When you go to Africa, you have the great kingdoms. When you go to Asia, you have great kingdoms, Africans, of course. When you go to India, you have great kingdoms. Wherever you go in the world, you have great kingdoms. But when you deal with European history coming about 1492, because, you know, there was no Renaissance. That is a miracle. For Europe to have a Renaissance is the greatest miracle that you could ever exist, that could ever exist. And the reason why I say that is because how can you be reborn when you were never born? Europe never gave birth to civilization. They merely stole Egypt's civilization. Every Greek doesn't have a script. Let me tell you what research is showing us. The Rosetta Stone was deciphered by Champollion Younger, Champollion Elder, other people. And what the Rosetta Stone found in a place called Rosetta in Egypt was so important because that's what helped them decipher Meduniter or hieroglyphs. They found on the top section, they found something written in hieroglyphics. Underneath it, they found something written in hieratic, and underneath that, they found something written in what they call classical Greek or Old Greek. What they don't tell you is that they were able to decipher the Greek because that was the language they could understand. And in understanding the Greek, they understood the hieratic, and in understanding the hieratic, they understood the hieroglyphics or the Meduniter. But what they don't tell you is that Greeks don't have a script. That every letter in the Greek script is Ethiopic, Kemetic in nature. Every one. There's a brother by the name of Quasi Milton who's written a book, and he will show you from alpha to omega, to beta to zeta, every figure that the Greeks have in their language is African. So the Greeks don't even have a language. They don't have a script. What the Greeks did was that the best thing they could do was write out in a halfway legible form what they could finally understand from their African master teachers. So really, the Rosetta Stone is written in 3 African languages, not in 2 African and 1 Greek, but the Greek language was African. And the art of writing, written by Quasi Milton, go to it and he will show you, letter for letter, from alpha to omega. Every script is Ethiopic, and that's why the Greek Coptic church comes out of the Egyptian Coptic church that comes out of the Ethiopic Coptic church. So that's why when you see Negus Negusti, and you see Haile Selassie, and you see all of these different concepts coming out of Ethiopia, the Rastaman is reviving what has been ours forever. And that's why there's such a close relationship. Now, the Bible is written, the original Bible was written, of course, in Greek. That's the end of the tape.